Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the St. Louis Advanced Angular Lunch. We are at Oasis Digital, where some of us here work, kind of the main sponsor of the thing. We occasionally have other sponsors, although I have not heard of one today. Today, we have Zachary Kipping presenting on a kind of advanced routing patterns. So this is going to be based on experience building sophisticated real things, and I am really looking forward to it. Hoping for a really great set of questions. So start thinking them while we go. Take it away, Zachary.
All right, cool. So like Kyle mentioned, so this entire talk is basically going to be me presenting over some routing patterns and or just native systems to Angular that are really important, borderline required for making complex Angular applications that are efficient, fast, etc. So first off, one of the building blocks, just one of the kind of relative basics, is nested routing, right? So this idea of I want views inside my views. Keynote there is viewception, right? It's kind of a thing that floats around the community. So if I want this viewception inside my template, it's going to end up in a situation where we have like multiple different layers of routing, right? So if we have our parent, which is usually kind of like our app component, and if we want our nested layers, we have our typical child routes, which might be like a main pages, main features of your application. If you want any kind of nested route here, kind of like where we have this child outlet, this third layer is going to start coming into existence. And then obviously just more and more layers get built up as you need more outlets on your screen at any given time. So the main thing here is that we have our main nav menu, right? So that's the nav menu that's existing on our parent component, that upper level root of our application. We have our main outlet, which is going to be like our router outlet, that element we use. And then if I actually want one of these child components, the thing that's decided upon in this main nav menu, we can actually decide what gets rendered into this child outlet through like side nav, steppers and forms, sub nav menus, etc., to get out what component we actually want rendered into that child outlet. Now, this building block isn't super like, oh, you need to use this in every single application, right? It's kind of a go by go in terms of what your application needs, right? So not every single application needs multiple child outlets, right? So in terms of that, mostly in my projects where I've seen this useful, at least, is things like stepper forms, right? Where I have multiple different steps in a form. I need to render out various forms based on where I am in that system. And that's also nice because we can also link into our route params, our state inside our paths, which I can talk about a little bit more later. So lazy loading. So lazy loading is kind of like the end-all, be-all, best possible thing you can use in any Angular application. Lazy loading not only is going to create like a little more tidy nests or layers in your application in terms of routing architecture, but it's also going to get you like bundling and better load times and everything like that. And what I mean by bundling is if we look over here, we can kind of see this is just an output of what I did in my example app real quick. But ignoring the fact that we have duplicate files here for every single JavaScript file, because Angular version 8 Plus just has support for ES5 and ES 2015 natively. But our main module here, our main JavaScript bundle, is the typical one you usually see in any application when you do a build, a prod build, or whatever. And that's the main thing you'd be shipping to your host or your server. Now, using lazy loading, I can actually say, all right, I want my Angular modules, my core feature modules of my application, if I've so segmented out my application, I want to actually separate those from my main bundle and shove those up as different files on my host. And in doing that, I can say, all right, I want to load those, not at the start, which typical SPA application will say, let's just load everything as fast as we can, eagerly load everything at the start of the application, which can drastically decrease your load times on startup if you have a very big, complex application. So what we can do is say, all right, split everything up into separate different modules, and I'm going to pick and choose when I actually want to load in features of my application, maybe dependent on what the current route they're on, maybe based on some heat maps of user data of where we know they go in the application, what's the next step, etc. So a cool thing about this, so how I actually do that deciding upon when we actually load something is something called preload strategies. So the very typical one I typically use is preload all modules. So that's the core main one that comes with Angular. And that'll actually allow you to get a best of both worlds in terms of, hey, I want to not eagerly load as much as possible when I start up my application, but I also don't want to accidentally run into a situation where I have like a very big feature module, maybe it's an entire chunk of my application. I don't want to accidentally load that later and have like an actual load time inside my application once the user's already clicking around, running through stuff. So what I can say is, all right, let's do this preload strategy, or preload all modules, and let's actually go about, preloading some stuff in the background while the user is clicking around navigating, so in hopes that the user can actually, get some stuff going in the background while they're kind of navigating. And I'll show that a little bit more later in the code. This is me just trying to ramble through some slides to get some different actual context for what's going on. So relative navigation is the main thing I actually want to talk about mostly. But nested routing and lazy loading kind of lead up to this topic, right? So I actually need to create multiple different layers in my application, so nested layers, whatever they may be, to actually make use of relative navigation. So quick raise of hands, and humor me with this. Who all uses relative imports with Angular? Like, in your TypeScript files, are you doing relative import file paths? Okay, so like 50-50-ish of people that are actually participating. So it's pretty important, right? It's more refactor proof. It's more lenient in terms of, oh, I'm going to move this chunk of code around. If it's pointing to everything inside the same directory, everything's hunky-dory, right? Well, same thing kind of goes for relative navigation, right? It's more non-destructive proof. So what I mean by that is, let's say we have this route here on the screen. And this is a real route in my example application where I have some employees feature. I have some data, so like an employee ID that I've selected. Then I have this task part of the employees feature. I have a task ID, so it's getting kind of long. And then I have this edit page that I eventually land on. So if I wanted to go from, like, say, edit back up to my task list for this particular employee, if I wanted to go absolute and destroy my entire bath and rebuild it, I would have to go from root to employees to this employee ID, which I have to get somehow, and then plop down onto tasks. Versus if I just did relative routing, I can make use of my dot slashes and dot slashes that you're probably familiar with directories. I can say, let's just go up 2 layers to my tasks from edit, so I can navigate saying, dot slash, either in HTML and TypeScript, and you're done. You don't have to re-inject your state into your navigation. All right. So that's my spiel on the actual slides, just so everyone has a little bit of context going into the code. So this is my example application. It's pretty basic. It's an application where it's pretty much just a to-do app, but I've just injected a lot of routing stuff into it. So there's a lot of layers, kind of like onions. OK. So on this employee's route, which is my main route, I had 3 main routes up above. So kind of like where you saw my build output, I had my home, I had my employees, and I had my bout. Those are my main feature modules of my application. And the employees feature has a bit of like a tab system here. So if I click on employee 1, then you can see that I have my general tasks, right? So it's not super apparent, but on the URL, I'm at like my /employees /some employee ID /tasks. So at this point, I could go through my form system. So I have a list of tasks here. I don't have any tasks because I just loaded my application. But if I wanted to, I could click on create a new task, make a new thing, like, I don't know, talk, and don't mess up, even though I can't type. And then I can submit it into the application, and it gets stored. It pops up in this list, and everything's cool. Notice how, as I was going through that, if I click create new task, I'm going from /tasks to /task/create. Might be kind of hard to see in the back just from the URL, but promise me on that. And then, or trust me on that, excuse me. And if I do any canceling or submitting, I get popped back up to the /task route. So pretty basic, not a lot going on here, but it has a good amount of code going on just to get this going. So if I hop into the code real quick, I'm going to go ahead and start my application again, just kind of had it kind of just living out in the wild. While that's going on, I'm going to go ahead and hop into the main part of the application here, which is my app routing module. So that's done nice and fast since I'm on Angular 9 RC3. But if I hop into my main routing module here, we can start to see where I lay out my architecture, lay out all the layers that I'm going through here. So let's go down a little bit just so I can get Hopefully everything in. Okay. So I have my main routes for my application all the way up at the root of my application. The main things here are these 3 objects right here. Those are my 3 main features of my application kind of laid out. And then I have 2 objects at the top and the bottom that do some redirecting for my application to make user experience a little bit smoother, easier, etc. So the main thing here is that I'm doing lazy loading. So instead of just saying I want to load some component when I'm on this path, I'm saying I want to load some file when I'm actually going to load the children of this path. So when I hit this employee's path, it's going to say, OK, we need to decide what we want to display here. You're not giving me a component to display, so you need to figure out what the heck is going on. And what we do to actually decide that is say, all right, I'm going to give you a function to load some file using just JavaScript import syntax. That returns a promise, and then I can just load my employees module. So at that point, just having this coding here allows me to create those bundles. So this employees module file is going to become a bundle. This home module and this about module are now going to become bundles, and will actually be loaded in lazily in my application when it's booted up. Now, another main thing, which the top one I see a lot. So just doing a bare bones redirect on an empty path to another path, right? Nothing too complicated. A lot of things that I see are, they don't always have this. I like to add it in any application that I work in, just because if you get to a situation where we haven't matched the empty path, or we haven't matched any of our other paths, I like to have a catch-all redirect that says, all right, you haven't hit any paths. Maybe let's go to a 404 page or whatever. But in my case, I just redirect to home because I didn't want to make a 404 page because I'm lazy. So second thing on this page, besides just the bare bones lazy loading, if I just had this lazy loading here, I'd be allowing for the problem of if I have too big of a feature, maybe my employee's feature has like 1,000 components or something, right? And it takes a long time to load if I was pulling it down from the host. Well, just here right now, if I didn't do any config options, I would have that load time in the middle of my application while my user's trying to punch through stuff and get things done. But if I add in this optional config object when I'm instantializing my router module for the root of my application, I can actually pass in this preload strategy property that I want to make use of, and I can give it whatever strategy I want to use, whether it's custom or pre-made. And the one I'm using here is actually the pre-made preload all modules. So I'm saying, hey, not only do I want to lazy load this stuff, but whatever route we're on, so if I landed on home, I would load the home module first. Excuse me. I would load the home module first, and then the other modules will be kind of eagerly loaded in the background, but not on startup. All right. And I'll come back to this in a second, but that has to do with state stuff, which we'll get into here in a second. So if I hop over to my employees module and hop into the employees routing module, the thing about lazy loading is since we do this module system, I'm loading an entire module in place of rendering a component, I actually need to let my module decide what actually gets rendered. So in the case of having this main outlet here, right, just hopping back to the slides real quick, having this main outlet here, instead of rendering a component, I'm actually kind of passing the baton to the module and saying, no, hey, you decide what component actually gets loaded at the end of the day. So that's exactly what I'm doing inside my employee module. I have another router module instantiated. Oops. I have another router module instantiated. I'm actually giving it a new list, some new layers of routing to tack on to my already existing architecture. And inside this, I have a basic path, which is a little bit weird, I'll admit. So I have a path of loading this employee's component, and then I have a path of some state loading the same exact component. Now, first off, that's kind of weird because why are we running the same component? This isn't going to reuse the employee's component. But if I hop into this component's HTML real quick, you can see it's a pretty bare bones component. It doesn't have a lot of logic or anything, so I'm not really wasting space loading it more than once. And really all it has is that nav bar where I select some employee and I render out some output. So that's a little bit weird. But the reason I did this is because Angular doesn't really have a concept of optional state in the URL, right? So if I wanted to not pass this but still kind of load this component, this is more or less how I would do it. You can do it in another way. You can also do some redirects and some fancy stuff like that. But typically, you'll end up with like a slash, nothing, slash, whatever your path is, which I prefer to just have nothing in the path and then maybe go to a new path if I need to. Cleans up the URL a little bit. All right. So some new syntax that I haven't gone over yet. So on this children, kind of similar to load children, right? So load children is saying I'm going to load some children whenever I get to this path. But in this case, whenever I provide some state, this employee ID, I'm going to load some objects, load some new architecture into my application. And in this case, it's literally just me dumping some components onto the screen where I need to. I have my default redirect. I have my task list component, which is that one that just kind of lists all the tasks. I have my task form component, which was the one on whenever I create a new task or edit a task, right? And then I have another path that's exactly the same, loading the same component. But in this case, I'm actually editing it versus creating. So I can pass in that state, load in the task from the back end, make some changes to it, and post it back up. All right, and then I also have my default catch-all, almost as if we're in a switch statement. I just catch everything with the wildcard and dump it back up the task. So that's how I end up with a system like this, right? So I can create a new thing, whatever. I can also mess up and fix my mistake while still having navigation kind of just flowing through. OK. So quickly hopping back to the app component module, I mentioned this property very, very briefly. Now, this is actually the first case where I've actually needed to use this inside this application. It was a weird thing that came up. But basically, all this says is for our inheritance strategy of state in our path, in our architecture. So me adding in an employee ID or a task ID or whatever your state is. By default, this property is assigned to, let me look at it. So empty only, right there. So empty only says if I'm on this employee route, these components in the children are really only going to be able to access this employee ID param if the route is empty. So I'm not just doing like task/create or task/whatever. If I did just task, they could probably access it, and they can. But it's just a weird little bit of wonky syntax where if you're deeply creating these paths, they might not be able to access the employee ID param because it's not a direct parent. So what's going on here is every time we add something to our path, it creates a new layer for the most part. And these layers have access to direct parents. So this edit would have direct access to this stuff. This create has direct access to this stuff. But it doesn't have direct access to the actual parent thing that I kind of want. So in this case, if I set that property in the root config, this always inherit everything from above in our branch, I can get access to all the state and the path leading up to this component. OK. So onto some fun stuff, like actually fun instead of just routing architecture. So if I hop to my task form component, more specifically my HTML, this is my current setup. This setup is bad. So what I'm currently doing is I have my cancel button here. So that button I click to go back to my task list, it's doing a router link here. So I'm binding to a router link. And I'm saying, hey, let's just rebuild everything from root. So earlier I talked about let's not do this. Let's not be destructive. Let's not just recreate everything and have to pull in our employee ID. And this is just some fun wonky syntax because I'm using strict mode. And I have template parsing. But I have to recreate from root, so /employees, /employee ID, /tasks. Versus, if I just wanted to use relative routing, it's pretty simple, but it's a nice gain. All I would have to do is a .. remove my binding, because I'm just doing some static navigation now. And everything still works beautifully. So not only did I clean up that, but I might also just clean up a dependency on pulling some state out of my paths. Now, I have the same exact problem in my actual TypeScript, because the TypeScript way of doing relative navigation is a little bit more complex. So I have a submit function down here. Don't really need to worry about the implementation too much. The main thing we want to worry about is this line. So I pulled in my router service, and I'm doing some navigation, right? I'm calling that navigate function. I'm giving it a path list, so I'm building up every single layer of my path that I want to route to. By default, this router.navigate goes from root. We're not giving it where we are in the current application. It's not super aware of everything that's going on. It just does its navigation, that's it. Versus the HTML, this router link directive, it's a little bit more aware. It takes in everything it needs to do. It gets access to where it is in the current location of our application and can do relative routing for you out of the box, which means do this as much as possible in your template because you can clean up your TypeScript code as well. So if I hop back to my TypeScript, how would I actually make this recreation of our entire path from root a little bit cleaner, right? So the way I'm going to do that is, one, I'm just going to delete all this stuff because I don't even want it. And I'm just going to say dot dot slash, just like we did in our HTML. But if I let this save and run, and I try and create a new thing, might need a refresh. We'll see. OK. So if I am creating a new thing, and I click submit, I just hopped all the way back to the root of my application, right? So all this is saying is, all right, from the root of my application, let's go up 2 layers. But there's no layers to go to, so it just kind of dumps you onto the root and expects you to be happy. Well, this isn't really what we're expecting, right? So if I wanted to actually give this navigate function like awareness of where it is in the application, I need to give it access to another service that kind of houses all of our state of our application, houses the state of our routing architecture. And that service happens to be, I think I already have it imported. Yes, I do. So I have this activated route service. So this is the thing where you actually get your state. You get your param state, you get your query state, et cetera. And I can use it as like de facto where I am in my application. So if I get access to this and I just dump this into here, so the navigate function has an optional config you can pass it, like a lot of the stuff in the Angular's API. If I pass it this relative to property inside this object, and I give it this .route, which is just what I named my activated route service when I injected it. If I give it this, and yep, I said it, didn't type it. OK. So at this point, we're saying, all right, navigate. I know you don't really care about where you are in the application, so you're just going to go from root. Let's go ahead and give you where you are in the application, and you can just hop out from there. So if I hop back to my application, go back to where I wanted to be, try and create something, I now hop back to where I wanted to be. So the cool part about this is not only do I save a little bit of code, right? Not too much code, but I just saved a little bit of my pathing. Let's say I was in a very complex application, because I'll admit this is a pretty basic application just to prove my point. But if my URL ended up having 2, 3, 4 pieces of state just to get down to the thing I wanted, like maybe we're in businesses, and then we're in a location, and then we're at an employee, and then we're at a task, right? All this chunks of state to get to what you actually wanted to edit, I don't want to have to replug every single piece of state into here. For this example, it doesn't matter too much, because I have access to the employee ID, because I needed it anyways. But if I don't have access to like the company or the location or whatever my employee is at, I have to re-pull all this stuff down, bloating out my, in this case it was in my ng on init, but I'm bloating out my component to go fetch all these IDs, all the state I need out of my path, instead of actually just letting everything flow and be natural in terms of just relatively navigating across my application. Now, I want to go super gung-ho on this. Oops. I want to go super gung-ho on relative navigation. I would use it as a default. But there are situations where you actually want to do absolute navigation, right? If I wanted to hop from, let's say, my employees component all the way to about for whatever reason, based on like a button or some user event, I would actually go from root. It makes the most sense. I don't want to enter into that dot dot slash dot dot slash dot dot slash dot dot slash etc. pathing where you kind of get with file imports too. I don't want to enter that very long path. I just want to go from root and go to the thing I wanted to anyways because it's faster. So default relative navigation, and then use absolute navigation when it makes most sense. Alrighty. And also to prove a point with the inheritance of state, I have a console log over here. If I can actually get my console open, ignoring everything else. So this bottom one here, that's my employee ID. If you can see it, I don't know, it's kind of small. All right, so I have my employee ID, and then the null thing is just a task ID I'm creating so I don't have a task ID. If I went ahead and removed that thing all the way up to routing, so if I remove that, defaults to empty only, I now don't have access to anything. It's undefined and null. So I quite literally don't have access to that piece of state I need to make this component work, which is why I brought that in, just to prove a little bit of a point. OK, so I finished a little bit early. But does anyone have any questions? Open discussion now at this point. Any questions about the example app? Any questions about any of the architecture I did? It's actually pretty neat, because a customer project I just did the other day, a PR opened up of, hey, I want to do this navigation to some other part of the application. Let's rebuild the entire path. And I was like, wait, stop. Hold up. Let's actually just take a look at this, and we can actually just go up 1 or 2 layers back to where we wanted to be, instead of pulling down all the state out of our application, out of our services even, to try and recreate the entire URL from root. So it's extremely important just to be able to actually navigate in that manner.
I have 50 questions, but somebody else will.
OK. There'll be a mic coming to you.
Oh, okay.
My name's Nathan.
How you doing, Nathan?
Not Mike.
So I want to put this scenario
Yeah.
out there, and I want you to tell me what you would do in this scenario.
Sure.
You want to navigate to a certain page, and that page has in the URL, it has 5 different IDs. So,
Okay.
Page and then
Right.
the ID.
Deeply
blah, blah,
nested,
blah.
yeah.
Yeah. You get the ID by running resolvers, which would mean that you would do the first navigation, you would run the resolve, get the results, use that result to navigate again to get the next, run the next resolve, keep getting it. And if that scenario could just take a long time to eventually navigate to what the user wants to see.
Yep.
Do you think that there's any way that you could, any ideas that you would try to address it so that you wouldn't have to
Pull down
run
the
through all of
data
that?
24/7.
Yeah.
So just to address what the current state of that application would possibly be in is, ironically, if you did relative navigation a lot throughout that, you wouldn't have to remake every single one of your resolvers in that chain, go refetch all the data. All that data would just still be there, still be propagated to where it needs to be, and you'd only re-pull down data that you actually need, like if you went up 1 layer and there's a resolver there. But in terms of like the whole resolver premise anyways, what I would probably recommend is, yeah, resolvers are good. But it kind of depends. So if I was doing that thing, I might institute like caching and stuff like that as well, because if you run into a situation where I'm just going back, there's been no changes made to that thing I'm pulling down anyways, I don't want to re-pull that thing down from the API. I might cache it a little bit just through services or whatever state management you might have. In terms of routing architecture, though, the resolvers are pretty much fine, and that's like your go-to for that situation if you want to get your state before you get to that component. So.
Do you think there's a way that you could make the resolvers sequential so that you can do all the resolvers in like one navigation and get all the data you need?
I don't think so, unless you brought it. So at that point, I wouldn't do a resolver. I would just probably bring it all out into a service. And if that service is linked up in a proper way, you can kind of just give it those IDs as you need from the components, and then go and grab all the data as you need it, maybe in a lower level resolver or even just in the component itself. So maybe that, but yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no worries.
On the preloading strategy,
Yeah.
So if they come in and let's say they start clicking routes right away as
Yeah.
it's trying to do this preloading,
Mhm.
have you come across issues with something like that?
Yeah, so if you just use the base preload all modules, that can be a problem, right? Because it just kind of runs through from root, what it needs to preload in the background, so it might not get to the things that are really important right away. So if the user's like clicking, spamming through the UI, they might end up on that loading. What you can kind of do, though, to like mitigate that a little bit, is you can make your own custom strategy where you say, all right, here's the core features of my application, and I know which ones are more important, either because they can load quickly or because everyone kind of congregates to that part of the application anyways, and say, let's go ahead and just like quite literally just make sure that preloads first to hopefully get around that. So there's going to be preloading no matter what. So if the user is clicking really fast through your application, they're going to hit that load. But at least they're not hitting that load right away whenever your application boots up.
How does the preload strategy work with like the can load guard?
So pretty much what happens is the can load guard will actually go first. So it'll say, all right, can we actually load, can we activate, can we enter into this component or this path or whatever? And then it says, okay, if we can, if it's successful, then it goes through the path of like actually trying to render the thing. When it tries to render the thing, it says, oh, I actually need to go pull down this thing from my host, bring it into my code base.
Yeah. So it will like rerun the guard. If it's not, if the module is not loaded, it'll rerun the guard again, potentially when the user tries to load the module.
Yes, yeah, I think I understand your question.
Well, isn't the loading of the JavaScript files is different from the activation of the route, right?
Yes, yeah, so can load versus actually can activate, yeah.
This sounds like something that I would look for coming new into the environment. Is documentation on how to do this really, is this solidly documented in literature, or do you have to invent it or dig deep to find it?
So in terms of like the actual code snippets themselves, so like how to actually do these things, yeah, it kind of is. So like any of the routing documentation on Angular.io is pretty good. It has everything kind of laid out. In terms of like what we actually do, like do the relative navigation, like injecting where we are in the application.
The relative stuff.
Yeah, the actual relative stuff. Like Angular kind of uses that literally under the hood whenever they do their like router link, the directive in the HTML. So all of that's just kind of open and out there on the documentation of like, hey, if you run into this situation, probably somewhere like 3/4 down the way the page, of if you need to do this, if you need to relatively navigate, like you do in the HTML by default with the router link, you know, this is how you do it. So yeah, it'll step by step kind of tell you like, hey, you need to inject this, pass it in here for this property, and then you're kind of good. So yeah, the documentation is actually really fleshed out for a lot of this routing stuff.
So this isn't a question, just a comment.
Okay.
I really liked your awaits in there.
Oh, async
versus
await?
subscribes. Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you for doing that. The
welcome.
question is, in the beginning you talked about how this kind of nests recursively kind of really, really well. And in your example, though, you kind of only have one layer of lazy.
Correct.
So my questions are, do you have any like experiences or insights on if I'm building a complex thing, is it okay if I end up 3 or 4 layers deep of lazy loading? Does anything terrible happen?
Yeah, so I think by default, when I go through most applications, when I'm first architecturing it, is by default, I'll just kind of have every single page more or less be its own module, just by default, just to get everything going and lazy loaded. And then as I go through the application, as I get more context and kind of let the application grow a little bit, I can kind of pick and choose what actually needs to be lazy loaded versus like just lazy loading everything. You know, being too eager as a developer to lazy load everything versus, you know, I actually just want to pick and choose these various modules. You know, some of the lower level components might be fine to just be a part of this greater module. So yeah, the nesting can get pretty deep with lazy loading, but 9 times out of 10, it's worth it just for the performance benefits and the potential to allow yourself to like, you know, create your own strategy, pick and choose what actually gets loaded. I'd rather have that customizability, that configuration from the get-go instead of having to like rebuild it from the ground up halfway through an application.
I've never nested lazily, where a module loads another module lazily. Do you have issues with that?
Not too much. Even in this application, like I did this to prove a point, just in saying like, oh, let's just load a component or whatever, right? But realistically, what happens a lot is if I had a situation where I have my, let me get back to it, excuse me. So if I have a situation where I have this employee ID param, right? I might have multiple different paths going about different things that employees can do, right? So at this point, the employee feature probably has 2, 3, et cetera features, and I would lazy load those. And then this path where I'm saying, oh, there's some state, let's go ahead and just lazy load that, make it its own feature, its own module. And at that point, all this children and stuff like that gets shoved even deeper a little bit. And we end up in a situation where like the ultimate best case scenario you want to end up with kind of lazy loading is this default pattern if I hop to like the about or something. Yeah, this is how minimum you should want your routing modules to kind of become, because this is the endpoint of your application, right? Where I'm lazy loading to some module that quite literally just has a couple paths and dumps out some components onto the screen to be rendered. I don't want like all this complex stuff in my child like actual outlets versus the actually lazy loaded modules that are deciding where the boundaries of my application kind of live. I hope that kind of answered it.
Just real quick, right?
Yeah.
Is that your hat? And if it is, where'd you get it from?
Not mine, technically Bill's. He got it from DevFest or something. Oh, he bought it at NGConf. Okay. Either way, I think Bill's wanting to give that away at the end or something. So. Bill wants me to give it away. Okay. Apparently to whoever asked the best question, I think, was the requirement. He did ask the first question. So.
He asked about the hat.
See me afterward.
Tautology of best hat question.
Right. Do you want the hat? Yes.
Meta question. Question about resource usage. These days, I think any platform you're going to run on is going to be very fast and have lots of RAM in it. What about bandwidth for doing all this loading? There are still a lot of real-world applications out in the backwoods and places where bandwidth is somewhat limited. So what is the trade-off there? And is there any? There's no use of local storage to buffer that, is there?
Not in terms of that. There is caching on the browser side a little bit. But in terms of that, lazy loading kind of shines here a little bit, just because typically spas are like I said, just eagerly load everything as much as possible and get all the data and code in, you're done, right? So lazy loading, with this, we can say, I just want to mitigate as much loading as possible at the front, which is fantastic for mobile, which is kind of where you're going with that, I think, is because mobile has a little bit lower RAM, a little bit lower CPU usage, et cetera, and people still have data limits, right? So I don't want to waste someone's data loading in like the entirety of the application, not just a website, an actual application. I don't want to load all that in where I can say, maybe just load in like a few of the smaller chunks where we know they're probably going to go to using some custom strategy, and let's leave off like the very big thing like a map or whatever that has a lot of resources, a lot of data, for when they actually need it, and then maybe just give them a nice load screen.
I think the key thing is while they are busy doing user interface stuff, you're busy working in the background downloading stuff for the next step.
Exactly, which can get a little bit dangerous, right? Because if you're loading huge things in the background, you're using up their data without them really knowing it. So you kind of really need to fine tune that if you're a mobile-oriented platform. So like I said, right, exactly, yeah.
Yeah, a couple of comments on this, Don. First of all, if this is a concern, and you're absolutely right, it should be a concern, you're going to want to come up with a custom preloading strategy like Zachary was talking about, where instead of preloading everything, you preload the things you know your users are most likely to need.
Frequently.
Yeah, soonest and most often. And there are some fantastic extra utilities you can use. Guest.js, which is actually from Minko Getchev, who is on the Angular team, can be wrapped up inside of Angular, and it will do essentially analysis of how your user uses the application and will then customize a preloading strategy for them over time. But even if you don't have to go that far, you can come up with your own. So if you have 100 features, but only 5 of them ever get used, and the other 95 are only on demand, you can absolutely create a custom preloading strategy for that. The main comment I wanted to make, though, is the choice that you're making here is not between, do I load this code or do I not load this code? It's like, how do I load this code? So to like the mobile platform question, it's better if you have done the loading in a way that doesn't block the user and doesn't slow them down. But the main thing is we were actually asked by members of the Angular team to introduce the concept of Angular lazy loading in our training early, because we used to introduce it as a fairly advanced router topic after people had really gotten used to routing. And they're like, can you tell people that like right out of the gate? Because we really need them to do that. Because the Chrome team keeps coming down the hall and beating us up because the applications are slow and people are blaming Angular, when in reality it's that they're loading a bunch of code up front they don't need to load. So taking advantage of this is actually the best thing that you could do for serving mobile users.
Yeah. And to that point, I mentioned just by the start of your application, just lazy load quite literally everything. Like go eagerly modulize everything, and then you can kind of decide and back off a little bit as you need to. Cool. Awesome discussion. Any other questions or comments or anything?
I noticed that query parameters didn't play a part in the show at all.
Correct.
Any thoughts on those? Because it felt at one point that you may have actually actively been dodging them.
Yes.
So
Okay.
what do you think?
I think query params are absolutely fantastic. So I actively tried to dodge state as much in this application as possible just because I wanted to hit the main points of doing lazy loading, doing this relative navigation to preserve state, not actively trying to create state. So query params are absolutely fantastic, and I love them. So like, if you need a situation, which honestly I kind of need with my forms, right? This optional kind of thing that I kind of want in my path, that's some state. But I don't want to navigate away to a separate page or separate feature to actually instantiate that state. I want to say, I want my question mark, I want my normal query parameters that you might expect in an application. Just let the user pass that in. It basically just becomes like a map, and you can willy-nilly swap things in and out as you need. And it's fantastic for situations where, like, if you have your Amazon search thing, right? I have a whole bunch of radio buttons and everything filters and blah, blah, blah. That's the perfect scenario for query params, but it's also fantastic for stuff like this, too. Okay.
How does the parameter inheritance that you were talking about affect query parameters, if at all?
Yeah, so good setup. So query parameters, unlike route parameters, so route parameters are kind of stuck in whatever layer they're kind of in. Query parameters are global for the most part. So you can actually make use of them inside your services too, which is fantastic, versus just being like siloed off into components, actual views. You can make use of like your filters and stuff like that to actively transform your data inside your services, inside your data layers, versus having to do all that inside your component, which is mostly should be as low level as possible, just displaying stuff on the screen, getting data, dumping it. Cool. Thanks.